All Things DER podcast, brought to you by AEIC. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Cook. In this podcast, I dig in, define, and discuss where the new energy economy is heading with electric industry leaders and explore all the ways that distributed energy resources can modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thank you for joining us. In today's episode, I'm talking with David Nestler, the engineering manager of the Planning, Development, and Operations Support Group at WE Energies and Wisconsin Public Service, serving Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula areas. We discussed the importance of organizational structure and recognizing red flags while utilizing the existing resources to efficiently evolve alongside the new power grid that DER brings. From solar power requests to managing a team that touches multiple departments in any given day, we cover the various ways to increase efficiency as these new DER technologies come on the market. So, David, thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to tip it right over to you to kind of introduce yourself and your place in WEC Energy.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Great to be here. David Nestler, engineering manager, and my group is called the Planning, Development, and Operations Support Group. We sit on the distribution side between our distribution planning group and then also between our electric distribution operators. So we support both the software and the data that both groups use. We're the group that brings our distribution models together for the planners to do load flows and studies. We also support operations questions from our dispatchers as they're trying to modernize the system. Our group traditionally had roles in building those models and keeping that data up to date. And as our company began to experience the DER transition, we started seeing both company and customer requests for distributed energy resources. Because we had the skill set and the tools with our load flow software, we were asked to help support the study work and that process. So it had value because we were one centralized group that could support these studies in a consistent format. So we didn't have planners in different regions doing things differently, but it also put a new load on us, as far as pun intended, a new load on us to plan and do this process as best we could, while still keeping our model up to date and doing other daily tasks.
Just for our listeners, I'm just going to, from your position, your utility. So where do you sit? What is your regulatory environment? And what assets do you currently own before the DER started looming in the background, I guess?
Yeah, WEC Energy Group is the holding company for essentially 3 different electric utilities. We Energies in Southeast Wisconsin, WPS in Central Wisconsin, and then also the UMERC utility, which is in the Upper Peninsula, Michigan. We had also just finished that merger acquisition kind of in the 2015 through 2017 range. So that was also an exciting time to get utilities combined. And then as in the state, we have both distribution and generation. Our transmission is owned by a separate utility, American Transmission Company, which all the distribution companies own part of and have voting rights on too. So my group works on the distribution side. We have interaction internally in the company with our generation folks and our generation planning folks, but we don't really sit in the same organizational department. So yeah, it's a good place to be because we have a lot of diversity in distribution, as far as northern Wisconsin with rural areas and southern Wisconsin with some heavily urban areas. So we have a good mix of that. We have plenty of distribution voltages, which is always fun to deal with as well.
So you're within a company that ultimately has generation T&D assets holistically. You're working within the division that's overseeing the distribution assets. And so you are, as a whole, are you allowed to own generation as a company on the distribution grid? Okay.
Yes.
That's very unique in some states. Those utilities are not allowed to own generation. So the whole idea of third-party generators at the distribution becomes a very a different way to approach it. So when we talk about third-party aggregators, is that something that, from a DER perspective, do you find your company could potentially own the generation as well as others own it, right?
It definitely seems to be. So we do have a pretty reasonable history with hydros in the northern part of Wisconsin. So there are both distribution and transmission connected hydros that the utility owns. So we have a little bit of experience with that. There were some wind assets that both utilities owned, some just connected to the distribution system. So there's a little bit of history with that. There was also a fairly big digester footprint at times, and it's starting to grow back up again in the state of Wisconsin with a lot of dairy farming in our community. So that has given us a little bit of experience. So we have some guidelines that were framed 15, 20 years ago, which have been useful in this process as it starts to grow, but it's definitely different because a digester is not an inverter-based source. With the onslaught of storage starting to come up, we didn't really have that opportunity before. So
it is a new world. So in Wisconsin, when you think about DER, is it predominantly over the last 4 or 5 years been more about like solar intermittent generation, or is DER, as your position, what you guys are thinking about, is it all encompassing solar as well as distributed generation, which you just meant hydro and digesters, et cetera, but also like electric vehicles and energy efficiency demand response? Does that kind of fall within the realm of things that you guys are considering, or like where are you on the journey of grid modernization, of preparing for that DER? So I kind of gave you a lot to talk about, but like you can really go any avenue, as we know this topic is very broad. So and we're all at different places in the journey.
Yeah, and in general, like I said, I think in the last few years, it's definitely been solar, whether it's roof mounted for customers or ground mounted over, agricultural land on the distribution. That's probably what's seemed to be the most popular lately. But in general, there's still smatterings of digesters being added here and there, some customer owned batteries, stuff like that, that we're still starting to try and learn and understand about. But in general, yeah, the big push the last few years has just been, where can sited solar be installed on our distribution system? So, and then I almost forgot about it, but demand response, our company had some history with it. Lately, it's been kind of quiet. We really haven't gone down that path much lately. I think it's definitely going to come around, especially as we see energy prices starting to creep up slowly but surely, if not too quickly in some cases, that we'll start to see that market kind of move. And then, electric vehicles. So we did just get kind of a state ordered request from our commission for all utilities to put together EV charger projects and rates. So we just got that approved late last year. And so we're starting to work heavily internally to develop that, provide options for our customers to get even better time of use rates for EV charging, and then also support some of that charging infrastructure, as it's likely become a very useful thing as more and more EVs get out there on the roads.
It's a very exciting time for your company as well as everyone else. And I think a great area. So for our listeners, when we think about the DER world, you really have to think about the fundamentals of a utility and what we have always done and what we are doing and where we're headed. So just to kind of check in, like you have your interconnection like process, and it sounds, that you guys get fed that information. I think that's a big topic in FERC Order 2222 world, which I've mentioned other podcasts, but you got your interconnection, which feeds into the planning, which ultimately feeds into project development, and then ultimately operations. So you're kind of, what I'm hearing is that team that had to really kind of quickly speed up. So I'm going to really ask you, like, lessons learned on organizational structure. The team was not really needed 5-10 years ago. And then as these DERs are coming in, the team that is really looking at those types of interconnections and tracking them, and then giving them to a planning organization that does your capacity loading, short-term, long-term planning, right? And then you also have the need to then run like real-time operation studies. And you guys are like, would you say, from what you said, like the team that helps support all of those groups?
Yeah, and it's definitely put us in a value, but at this point, it seems well-loaded position. We, like you said, I also actually, and I didn't even mention to this, I do support our electric GIS mapping team as well. Like their leader reports to me. So, I have a vested interest to make sure that we're adding the background data and controls in our GIS so that we are prepared for the future when we have more DER out there, so that data can flow into our mapping systems and into eventually an ADMS or a DERM system. Again, the starting out piece is making sure that, well, what we know we have, let's get that data in there. Because again, as we study it, we need to know, what other DERs are on the circuit or the substation that we're studying. And then, like you said, the next piece, the study piece, we're starting to develop, we utilize our different departments across the WC Energy Group to get that information into us, whether it's a customer service department or in general, some of it sits under our agriculture department because of the history at our company. So they're feeding us in the application information. They're receiving questions from the customers and folks that are developing these DERs on our sites. So it's a kind of I guess a tiger team, or a select group of people that have just essentially meet weekly basis to kind of keep track of all these processes and things as they're being developed. It's become useful as our group are looked to as the experts for a lot of these questions and things, and then we have a good position where we can reach out to different groups in our distribution engineering department, whether it's substation or protection, and get those answers that are needed for either customer projects or internal projects. it's been a learning process to develop those connections and communication. Again, because of where we sat and our involvement both in operations and planning, a lot of those connections were already there, but just kind of building the process to make sure that we're dropping the ball on these requests, and if somebody asks a question, we can get the answer and meet our state required deadlines as we process these. So that's been interesting. And then kind of into the next piece, well, as we get an approved application and either the developer or the internal entity wants to move forward with the process, it's okay, well, we know about studying the project, but actually building them, getting the design and that work done is something that we're really just starting to get more skilled at, finding resources both internally in our department, then also, if it's our generation fleet that's requesting it, finding their resources to make sure that they have folks that are available to help us set deadlines, meet deadlines, et cetera. So that's definitely a learning point for us there.
So I think, thinking through, I think, utilities and we're known to not maybe be very agile, and, maybe we're more risk, prone. We want to observe and ensure that we're not like moving the arrow too fast. I don't know what the analogy I was looking for, but from your experience, what do you think the red flag was in regards to numbers? I think a lot of us in the utility space is for instance, where I'm from, Western PA, the sun don't shine. So it was like solar's never coming. But then there was a few folk that were intimately involved with the interconnection. It's like, well, this is doubling year over year. So when is enough interconnections or enough standard requirements or application processes, right? Trigger the need for this type of group that you guys kind of stood up. Because what I heard you say, which I don't know if you said it, is you literally touch 9 different entities from the moment of the indicating that the asset or new technology is connecting, and how your team ultimately has inputs to 9 other groups. So that's, something that may get lost, I would say, right, in a large organization. Do you think I heard that correctly? I mean, you said customer, you said operations, you said GIS, then are you IT or are you ops? I think that's also another world. Do you sit more in the IT or ops world?
I think we like to say we sit more in the ops world. No offense to the IT folks out there, but it's just easier to sit with the operations folks, and because they're the ones that, you feel like get the customer's power back on in the end of the day. So you like to be sometimes a part
You're
of that.
Doing a lot of IT. Is that why you're saying?
Oh yeah, for sure. Plenty. I mean, again.
Yeah.
And like everybody, we're IT constrained, right? You only have so many folks that can get some of this work done. So it's always just you got to put on the hat that you need to wear at the time it comes. So
I definitely threw a curveball there because I asked you a question after you asked the first question. So what would you think is the red flag indicator that a utility should be preparing for all those groups?
I was super lucky. I had an engineer that joined my company from Minnesota. Well, he was from the border of Minnesota, Wisconsin. So he had some red flag experience. So he was a couple of years ago warning me. He's like, you only see one now, but he's like, there's going to be a queue and there's going to be questions and you need to be ready. And I said, okay, yeah, sure. So luckily he was there to kind of give me that warning. But it was really, once we saw 2 requests on the same substation bus, it was like, wait a second, this is real. We need to keep track of who's first, who's second, how big they are, how much the second project is going to influence the first. And they haven't been built yet, but just having that request on the same substation bus to us was like, I don't know, send shivers up our spines a little bit, but it's helped us grow. And now we have multiple buses with multiple requests on them. So we're just starting to figure out, okay, well, how do we handle that? How do we make sure that we follow the rules in Wisconsin were written, 15 years ago plus. So a lot of that wasn't clarified. So we have sort of just had to build internal rules. In addition, in Wisconsin, they're looking at reviewing the rules, and we've kind of pushed them to say, hey, let's make sure that we have some clarity in what the expectations are so that treating all these requests fairly. So definitely a red flag.
So the red flag is, hey, if they're coming just a little bit, and I would say, lessons learned, and I'm just going to kind of jive off of, what you shared. And really my experience that I'm living in is, I think the key to simplify maybe other people's paths that may be more immature than us is, ensuring that there's a specific chain of command that can give decisions, because these decisions need to be made quickly, especially in the environment. Would you agree with that one?
Oh yeah, we've definitely found ourselves hitting deadlines as far as, all right, well, we need to decide this today in this meeting because, the 10 days are up on this customer's, project, and we need to give them an answer.
And one part of that process is determining who is the expert. So like, I think a key, stage or task to do, it would be identifying the experts and the go-to people, and then they are ultimately the ones that can make the decision. Because as you said, that time, you should be proactive instead of reactive. And then ultimately, if you set up that process, that command decision with the experts aligned and all the consensus that we're going to do this right at the get-go instead of as you're doing it, it's very strengthening in regards to it's collaborative, and you can share quickly. So you kind of set up those processes. Is that kind of been your experience? And you would share with others who are about to embark on this?
Yes, and I'm sure many have experienced it too, but don't let perfection be the enemy of a success, right? We found ourselves many times like, oh, let's get this flow chart just right. And it's like, no, just get the flow chart out, make it shared, and then people can put holes in it once it's started. But yeah, we found many times that just moving quickly is your best bet. Be cautious. For engineers typically, so we're pretty cautious on our own. We don't need to worry about being overly cautious. So
that's an excellent point. Okay, well, I think this was a great conversation. I think you shared a lot. Thank you, David. That's a wrap for this week's episode of All Things DER. Thanks for tuning in. I hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode next week. Until then, keep powering on.